Good to see you tonight. Thanks for being here as we join together for Bible study on Wednesday night. We're studying in this Wednesday night class, we're studying about the miracles of Jesus. So many interesting episodes, each of them unique, but all of them with the same purpose. And we keep trying to emphasize the purpose of the miracles to reveal and confirm Jesus as the only begotten Son of God. And to an unbiased observer, the point is getting made. But to the prejudiced ones, the Pharisees, his enemies, who were so jealous of their power, even when they had to admit that miracles were being performed, they still wanted to resist the conclusion about who Jesus was and what they should do. So we'll see more of that as we go along here. We're studying Lesson 10 tonight. If you have your study guide, if not, you'll be easily able to follow along with us as we look to these different scriptures. We're going to look at 3 different episodes of healings that Jesus performed. We've looked at some of the healings already as we've been looking at miracles, but we're going to look at three cases here this evening. The first one is found in Matthew 9, Mark 2, and Luke 5. We're not going to read all of those. Let's go to Mark. Let's go to Mark chapter 2 and read Mark's account of these events, and then we'll comment. Mark chapter 2. Mark 2, beginning verse 1. He entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. And straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word unto them. And they come unto him, bringing one of the sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there, reasoning in their hearts, Why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? And immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, Why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether is it easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise and take up thy bed and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way unto thy house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, We never saw it on this fashion. All right. So here in Mark's account, it identifies the place where this miracle took place as being in Capernaum. Now, it's interesting that in Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 9, it says when he passed over and came into his own city. So Matthew says it was his own city, and Mark and Luke identify it as Capernaum. Mark does, at least. I'm not sure if I didn't write in my notes whether Luke says Capernaum or not. It's kind of interesting. This is just a little side note, but some commentators think that Capernaum sort of served as Jesus's base of operations, if you will. I don't know if that's even a good expression to use, but it was sort of home base for Jesus when he was doing all his traveling and preaching work. And there are even some who would argue that he kept a house there, that maybe he had a residence that he used while he was in Capernaum. That's speculative. I don't know if you could prove that. Yeah, Sarah.
Matthew 4:12 says, Now when he heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. And I believe that was part of the prophecy as well, wasn't it? That he'd be in that area.
I don't know about Capernaum specifically. Are you thinking Capernaum specifically? I'm sorry?
The Zebulun and Naphtali area. It was part of the prophecy, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, you're talking about the territory, not the city. Okay, yeah. You may well be right about that. I think you may well be right about that. You'd have to share those verses with me, but it's kind of interesting to note that he is, of course, Capernaum is a city in Galilee on the northern bank of the Sea of Galilee. But I thought it was kind of interesting. It's called, Matthew refers to it as his own city, Capernaum.
Mark says at the end of verse 1, it was heard that he was at home.
That he was in the house.
Okay.
The King James says he was at home. The King James says in the house. So whether that was his own kept house or not, but a lot of commentators kind of speculate that it was, that maybe he kept a house there. All right, so the thing that intrigues me about this episode is that the men come carrying. The King James says that the man was sick of the palsy. Newer translations probably say something like he was a paralytic. This guy couldn't walk. He was paralyzed probably in some form or fashion. What might have been the cause of that? I don't think anybody would know for sure, but there are certain ailments that certainly would manifest with that kind of a symptom. So I've always wondered, the guy who was healed certainly was happy that he was healed. The fellows who cared enough about him to carry him there, to get him in Jesus' presence, certainly would have rejoiced knowing that the man was healed, because they obviously cared for him. I've always wondered, what about the guy whose house it was? If it was Jesus' house or whoever, they just tore my roof apart. No reference to that. If it was maybe Jesus' own house, maybe he wouldn't have minded that either. What's interesting is that, we've talked before about, in order to receive a miracle, you have the argument made by the fake healers of our day is, you've got to have faith to receive a miracle. And if you don't receive the miracle, the problem is you don't have enough faith. And that's what they always say. That's their always, get out of jail card. If they fail to perform a miracle, and they always do, of course, but if they very obviously fail to be able to perform a miracle, their always comeback is, you didn't have enough faith to receive the miracle. Whose faith is noted here? Not the guy who received the miracle, not the paralyzed man, but verse 5, when Jesus saw their faith. That is, the men who carried him there, the men who let him down through the roof. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the sick of the palsy, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." Pretty amazing, I think. And again, this would just go to that broader argument. Do you have to have faith to receive a miracle? Back then, did they have to have faith to receive a miracle? No, they did not. There are numerous instances when people received miracles who didn't even have a chance to manifest faith. Now, sometimes it is noted that they had faith. Other times it's not mentioned at all, and pretty clearly it wouldn't even have been possible for them to have faith. And so that was not a prerequisite in New Testament times. And those who are today's fake healers maybe we could say that they don't have a leg to stand on. Maybe that's supposed to be a pun. They don't have a leg to stand on. All right. So now here's what happens. Jesus says, the first thing he says. So here's the scene. Jesus is preaching in the house, maybe his own house, possibly. He's in the city of Capernaum. Suddenly, as he's teaching, there's a commotion on the roof and parts are flying. I mean, they're tearing the roof back and they're letting this guy down into his presence. That would have been kind of a startling interruption. Every once in a while in our worship services, there'll be some sort of an interruption of one sort or another. A few weeks ago, we had a wasp flying around in here, kind of disrupted things. I don't know how many of you can remember several years ago, a bird got in here. Somehow or another, a bird got in here, a bird was flying around. Well, those would be interruptions, but not like this. This would have been a pretty startling interruption. The roof is torn back. This guy is coming down. And the first thing that Jesus says to him is, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." Wow, that seems peculiar that he would say that. And he got a reaction. I think he did it intentionally for this reaction. But verse 6, there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? You know, what I would argue that that's the proper response. That's the proper reaction, right? So how would you react tonight if I stood up here and said, Brian, I forgive your sins. Bob, I forgive your sins. Eric, I don't forgive your sins. What would be your reaction to that? I hope your reaction would be, why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? Right? That's the right reaction. They don't, at this point, they don't believe that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. He's, at this point, in their understanding, and they haven't been proved otherwise yet, in their understanding, he's a man. Men can't forgive sin. Only God can forgive sin. And so I'm thinking that what they said was not out of bounds at all. It was actually the right reaction. And as I said, I really think that Jesus probably said it this way to draw out that reaction, because he's wanting to identify himself as God. And so this gives him a chance to do that. And so Jesus perceived. Notice they were reasoning in their hearts. So they're thinking this. There's not even any indication that one of them leaned over and they said, what about this guy? Who does he think he is anyway? There's not any indication that they were whispering among themselves. It says they were reasoning in their hearts. They're thinking, this guy is off. But notice, immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, Jesus knew their thoughts. Jesus was aware of what they were thinking. And again, I'm saying what they're thinking was right, and Jesus is aware of what they're thinking. And he says, okay, which is easier to say? Thy sins be forgiven thee, or arise, take up thy bed and walk? Which is easier? His point is, I can say either one just as easy as the other. But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he said to the sick of palsy, I say to thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way into thy house. And it says, immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all. So it's interesting how Jesus worked that, right? He said something intentionally to provoke a reaction. He got the reaction, and then he used that as a teaching moment. I can as easily forgive this man's sins as I can heal his ailment, his disease, his infirmity. And so he did one to prove the other. He proceeded to tell the man, arise, take up thy bed and walk. And when the guy did, immediately, it was proof that he did have power to do the other, to forgive the sins, right? And so we've been emphasizing over and over again that the miracles were for that intention. And this one really brings it out, doesn't it? That he even developed the argument in such a fashion. He developed the progression of this episode in such a fashion as to get that out in the open. I can just as easily say, thy sins be forgiven, or take up thy bed and walk. I can do either one. I am the Son of God. He calls himself the Son of Man, which is obviously a reference to him being the only begotten of God. Again, I think it's interesting that I think he intentionally did it that way. But look at the reaction. The reaction at the last half of verse 12. Insomuch that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. So the very people who initially were thinking, if not saying, were thinking, who does this guy think he is? Only God can forgive sins. So they had a very negative initial reaction. I think an appropriate negative reaction. But at least these were open-hearted enough that when they saw the amazing miracle, they were willing, open-hearted enough to admit, we never saw anything like that before. That beats anything I've ever seen. Nobody does this. This Jesus is someone very special. We've talked several times as we've been going through these miracles about the immediacy of the miracles. And so this guy was in such a condition that he couldn't get to Jesus on his own. It was necessary for these other men to bring him. I knew a preacher friend years ago who preached a sermon, and he called it 4 Men on a Roof. And he took it from this text. What's interesting here is how that it served the purpose. This guy was in bad shape. He was in such bad shape he couldn't come on his own. They had to carry him. Immediately, he was able to walk and take up his bed or cot or whatever they had brought him on and carry that himself. Now, we've asked Ricky about this before in regards to, what would it take for a man who has been experiencing some form of paralysis? This doesn't say how long that paralysis was, but however long it may have been. If it had only been a short-lived thing, but more than likely it was a long-lived thing, this guy would have to have therapy, right? He's not going to get up and start walking normally. He's been paralyzed. He's going to have some intense therapy. If it's been going on for a long time, he's going to have to learn how to walk all over again. You don't just jump up, start walking, and by the way, carrying your cot with you as you go. That speaks to the immediacy of the cure and the totality of the cure. Just instantaneously, he's able to walk and carry his bed. Karen.
I always come back to this statement that Jesus made also when he mentioned about the thief on the cross, when he forgives while he's here on earth, he forgives him at that time. Do you think that has any bearing on that as well?
Well, sometimes this would be a good one to tie into that, because sometimes, we'll hear people say, well, I'm going to be saved like the thief on the cross. He wasn't baptized, Why do I can be saved without being baptized? The thief on the cross was saved without being baptized. Sometimes people will quibble, maybe he was baptized by John, maybe. I don't even think it matters. While Jesus was on earth, he could personally and directly forgive sins. After he's dead, the only way that we can obtain that blessing is via his last will and testament. In other words, he's not here to tell us your sins are forgiven. And so we've got to go through the process in order to have our sins forgiven. We've got to go through the process that the New Testament reveals. But one of the answers that we make to the thief on the cross argument is, that's not the only guy whose sins Jesus forgave while he was here in person. This is a good example of that. While he was here, he could do that. After he's dead and gone, we can only do it by way of his testament, right? That's the answer, and I think it's a good tie-in. Anybody else here have a thought? Gary?
Just people were talking about the thief on the cross. He made an appeal to Jesus. Because he knew his state.
Yeah. Remember me, he asked you. This guy didn't say anything that we know of, and yet Jesus could forgive his sins. Exactly right. All right. Any other thoughts on this episode? It is interesting. We didn't read Luke's account. They're all very, very similar, almost identical, all three of them. But, we a lot of times we like to point out, Luke, the physician, records this miracle. So Luke was a true historian, but he was also a physician. And so he would have had basis to understand the kind of infirmity that this man was experiencing, and he recorded the miracle as it happened. All right, let's go to the next one. It's short. It's just a couple of verses. Again, three recordings of it. Let's use Luke's. They're all almost identical. Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4, verses 38 and 39. He arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house, and Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great fever, and they besought him for her. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she arose and ministered unto them. That's one of the shortest healing miracles that I think we see recorded. One of the things, you may have this noted as I do in the margin of your Bible, who was this? Now, tell me again, who was it? Peter's wife's mother. Peter's mother-in-law. Wait, Simon's wife's mother. Simon's wife? Wait a minute. Peter was a married man. We're supposed to believe Peter was the first pope, and all that the Catholics have so grossly insisted about celibacy of the priests and all of that. Of course, Peter wasn't the first pope. There wasn't a pope. But I've never had a chance to get a Catholic to give an adequate answer to that. Why would it be that Peter was obviously a married man? Why do popes today supposedly have to be celibate? Why do all the priests have to be celibate? With all the complications that produces in the Catholic Church, and all the sex abuse allegations that they've dealt with through time, and here's Peter, a married man, supposedly the first pope. I just think that's just ironic to point out. Her symptoms are noted that she was dealing, and again, this is Luke. Luke the physician said that she was taken with a great fever. Well, we've all had fevers, and I'm sure many of us at various times have had, really pretty severe sicknesses where maybe we had a high fever. We have the comfort of knowing if it gets bad enough. Because Cindy's always quick to say, we better go to the emergency room. We better go to the emergency room. And I'm not going to the emergency room. She's always quick to say go. I'm always dragging my feet just as hard as I can, about that. But at least we have the comfort of knowing that if it's a really bad thing, we can go get some attention. The medical advancements have made it so that you're not going to probably have to die of a high fever. You might. If it's a bad pneumonia or something, it could take a life, especially of an older person, but not likely. If it's bad enough that you have to go get medical attention, they'll help you. They'll give you an IV, and they'll pump fluids in you, and you're going to come back around more than likely. So even though we hate to deal with sickness, think of what it would be like if we didn't have that in the back of our mind. If it gets bad enough, I can go to the ER. If it gets bad enough, I can go to the doctor and get meds. Not these people. And so it would have been far more common for people in that time of day to die of a fever. If it is a pneumonia or something else like that, so we just read, it's just a fever. You read fever in that day and time, and that's probably life-threatening. And this was a great fever, Luke says, that she was dealing with. And then, again, the cure of it, immediate, it left her. He rebuked the fever. It left her, and immediately she arose and ministered unto them. Okay, you've been real sick, and what the expression we use, the fever breaks. Oh, the fever broke last night during the night. I was just wringing wet with sweat, and the fever broke. The next day, I'm going to tell you, I feel like I've been run over by a truck. The fever may be gone, but I'm not doing any jumping jacks. I'm down. And it's going to take a few days for me to get my strength back. Not in this case. She's up immediately and serving them. She attends to them. She ministers unto them. And so you have to think that may have included things like, fixing food for them or whatever else was needed. She was ministering to them in the sense of a woman in her house, taking charge of the hospitality requirements. Pretty impressive. Thoughts or comments? Anybody? Anything? All right. Okay, we got one more here, and this one's real interesting and a little bit challenging. Let's go over to John 5. So the third healing episode that we want to discuss is in John chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. John 5, verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first after the troubling of the water stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus said unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. On the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day, it is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered them, He that made me whole, the same said to me, Take up thy bed and walk. Then asked they him, What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple, and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. All right. So, in this instance, the miracle is in Jerusalem, right? Jesus has gone to Jerusalem because there was a feast of the Jews in Jerusalem. Jesus had gone there. Now, I think there's a point to be made there. So, an argument or a quibble could be made. Jesus performed these miracles out in the middle of nowhere. And then his disciples came into town and said, You won't believe what Jesus did. Oh, sure. He goes out there in the middle of nowhere and he performs these miracles. And we weren't there, we didn't see it, but we're supposed to believe that he has the power to do all these miracles. That's just not true. You all are so gullible. And by the way, we're not nearly as gullible as you. We're not going to believe that. No, that argument doesn't stand, does it? Because in this instance, the miracle that was done was right there in Jerusalem. Right in the heart of it all, Jesus was performing miracles there. Okay, now, there is a pool, it says, the pool of Bethesda, 5 porches, and in these 5 porches lay a great multitude of impotent folks, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. Now, so the question asked is, why were they there? They were waiting for the moving of the water. Now, what about verse 4? Verse 4 is the controversial one. So, it explains, there's nobody talking here, there's just an explanation offered. Jesus didn't say this, and the man healed didn't say this. And so this seems to be an inserted explanation of why this crowd of people, there was a crowd of people there, no doubt, a crowd of sick, impotent folks were there. But verse 4 seems to be sort of a little explanation as to why. Supposedly, an angel would come at a certain season, a certain time of year, an angel would come and stir up the water, trouble the waters. And the first one who could get into the water after the angel had stirred it up was made whole or healed of whatever ailment he suffered. All right, you probably know this, but that verse is in question. The legitimacy of that verse is challenged a lot. The earliest manuscripts do not include verse 4. And you might note, if you're reading a newer version, I was looking at the English Standard Version, which I look at pretty often, it completely skips that verse. Your printing may have the verse, but have it bracketed or somehow footnoted. The printing I was looking at just skipped from verse 3. There was no verse 4 in the chapter, went right straight to verse 5. So the verse is in question as to its legitimacy. It's not in the oldest manuscripts and may have been added later. One interesting thing that I was reading is that 4 of the last 5 words in that verse, in the original language. In the original language, 4 of the last 5 words in that verse are not found anywhere else in the writings of John. That doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it sort of raises some suspicions. Maybe John didn't write that. Maybe some scribe added that in, and it was. I also read where that in some of the manuscripts, the verse is the manuscripts that include it, which are later, but not the earliest ones don't. But the later manuscripts that include it actually have a footnote or an asterisk or some kind of denotation there to later scribes to be aware that this verse is questionable. I don't know. To me, it certainly doesn't negate the miracle that Jesus performed. But just be aware, and you might note that in your margin, that verse 4 is strongly questioned as to whether it was there in the original or was added later. And a lot of people, probably the vast majority of textual critics, think that it was added in later. Now, here's the question. What about this? What about this angel troubling the waters? Whether verse 4 is there or not, in verse 7, the impotent man said, "Sir, I have no man that when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I'm coming, another steppeth in before me." And so whether verse 4 belongs in the text or not, it seems clear that there was an understanding among the Jews, especially those who were suffering with ailments and infirmities. There was an understanding that this pool of Bethesda had powers. And when the water stirred, if you could get in first, you had a chance of being healed. They definitely, these sick folk in Jerusalem definitely believed that. Okay. Now, what do you think? I think there's anybody want to tackle that right up front? Wayne, you got a thought?
Well, if it did happen, it was simply God's grace given to men.
Yeah.
It would seem kind of funny because if that were true, because the healthiest guys are always going to get there first.
Yeah. The sickest one is never going to get the help, right? I think that's one of the potential explanations is what Wayne offered. Maybe it was so. Maybe God was. It was a time of miracles, and maybe God was working a miracle at the pool of Bethesda. It seems out of character, but remember, and again, I think this would fit the pattern. Miracles are to prove the power of God, and this would prove the power of God. But it's different in the sense that it wasn't revealing any specific about God, other than maybe that God had the power to heal ailments. Sarah. Yes.
So President Roosevelt had a place there just because he thought those springs there had healing powers so that it would help him with his infirmities. And it could have been the same thing with them, that they saw some improvement in the water, the minerals that were in it,
Yes.
the way the water was stirred up.
I think that's another good explanation. Because there are lots of places in our country and around the world where there are mineral springs or hot springs. And back in the day, and again before there were more modern forms of medicine, very sick people would go to those mineral springs, those hot springs, because they thought there was medicinal benefit from being in those waters. And that may be an explanation of what was going on at the pool of Bethesda. That wouldn't be out of character, because that still takes place. Here we are 2,000 years later, and they're still doing that sort of thing. JD?
And obviously, talking about those hot springs, if you've ever been to them, they bubble.
Yeah.
Some of them do because of the currents or
Yeah.
whatever's
Yeah.
going on. And sometimes they're calmer and sometimes they're more pronounced. So
Yeah.
it could be that could be the explanation for certain times of year they were more trouble than others because
I
they
think-
natural patterns.
I think so too. Go ahead, Eric.
I guess I'm simpleton. I just take it for what it says there.
Well, the scripture says they are in our behalf.
I think this is an angel.
This would have been a physical manifestation that we don't think happens today, but we do think that angels are active in our behalf in the world even today. So a couple of explanations here. One is maybe it was true. Could have been. Second explanation is maybe the people just believed, as people even today believe, in the medicinal benefits of mineral springs, hot springs, and so forth. Herman?
They were there for some reason, and they knew something about it, so why not?
Yeah, exactly right. So I think you all have hit on two really excellent explanations there. I would offer just one more. As it was a commonly held myth, there wasn't any truth to it, but the people believed it. You know, people believe things that are, especially if you're hurting and you need a cure, maybe you're more inclined to grasp onto things like that. I think the third explanation is just a myth. Did you notice that Jesus neither confirmed nor denied that the pool of Bethesda had any powers? So if it was a myth, and if it wasn't true at all, Jesus didn't take a side on that one way or the other. He just didn't. And so, you know, I'm just making that point to highlight that those who would criticize Jesus and say he was playing on the gullibilities of the people, no, he didn't. He didn't comment about the healing or lack of healing powers of the waters of Bethesda. He just didn't. And so you couldn't compose an argument against Jesus based upon this episode. And on this episode, the guy was there. He explained why he was there. Jesus didn't comment one way or the other. What Jesus did do was that he healed him. And again, an instantaneous healing. Verse 5, a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. So how long had this guy been unable to walk effectively? 38 years. So he would struggle to get himself up to get to the water, but he says, when Jesus saw him lie, knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he said to him, wilt thou be made whole? Again, I kind of take verse 6 as an expression of Jesus' compassion on the fellow who had been suffering for so long. And then the impotent man, verse 7, answered him, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus said to him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, took up his bed and walked. On the same day was the Sabbath. So, again, same point we've been making over again. Immediate cure. This guy had been laid up for 38 years. He's certainly not going to be able to walk normally or carry a load, but he does. And it speaks to the immediacy and the totality of the cure that Jesus performed. Now, one question is, why would Jesus heal that guy and not heal others? It says in verse 3 that there lay a great multitude of impotent folk. Why would Jesus heal this guy and not others? James?
Well, it's not recorded what he did and what he didn't do. We just know about this one man. If Jesus spent the time healing a sick person, he wouldn't have time to do his work that he came to do.
Yeah. I think two parts to your answer that I think are both right. One, we don't know that he didn't heal some others. It's just not stated. You got to really be careful about reading more into the text than's there, or trying to read something in that's not there. He may well have healed some of the others. But again, to your second point there, James, healing wasn't the main thing. Teaching was the main thing. And if Jesus allowed these, remember we've talked about this a lot in our study, very often Jesus would heal somebody and says, don't tell anybody. He would tell them, now go home, but don't tell anybody. But of course they always did. But if Jesus wanted to, he could spend every waking moment healing sick people. But that wasn't his main purpose. His main purpose was to proclaim the good news of the gospel. JD.
I mean, just pure speculation, but a lot of the recorded miracles where Jesus healed people, they seem, or even the apostles, it seemed to be people who were pretty widely known in the area as having had that infirmity for most of their life, like most people had seen them. So it wouldn't be a case of, hey, there's a guy who broke his leg yesterday, and most people don't know about it, now he's saying, Jesus healed me.
Yeah.
So part of his, thing is to confirm who he is.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear, hey, that guy, I'm 30 years old, and every day of my life that I can remember, I've seen that guy laying there.
Yeah.
And now he's walking.
Yeah.
So,
It's been proven, it's been documented a lot of time that these fake healers of our day, they'll have plants in the audience.
right.
So it's all put on show. But the way these miracles are laid out and the way they occur, there was no chance for that sort of thing. Exactly right. Anybody else, Gary?
There's also another teaching on this. So this was the Feast of the Jews. This was when they remembered their exodus from Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea. When they crossed over, according to Deuteronomy 2:14, they had wandered for 38 years. And so here, this was this feast that they was having. This was done on the Sabbath, and this man was 38 years old.
Huh.
I've heard been there.
He'd been suffering with this 38 years at least. Interesting.
Plus, he was hopeless, just like they were.
Yeah.
They was in a hopeless situation. They was under the bondage of the Egyptian.
Okay. Interesting. I never thought of that. Interesting. Okay, so we're just out of time. But what's always amazing is that the Jews, Jesus' enemies, the elite leadership of the Jews in Jerusalem. Remember, this happened in Jerusalem. The elite leadership of the Jews in Jerusalem said, "Hey, what are you doing walking around here carrying your bed? This is Sabbath day. You're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day." And they said, "How come you're doing that?" And the guy said, "Well, the guy who healed me told me to carry my bed, get up, walk, carry my bed." And so, this just goes crazy. Here's this guy who's been sick for 38 years. I can't be happy that he's well. I've got to find something to pick about this Jesus. He's done this on the Sabbath day. So, and many of you are good students of the Old Testament law of Moses. Would you understand anything in the law of Moses to suggest that this would have been a Sabbath violation for this fellow who's been so sick and now is immediately well to take his bed and go home?
What really amazes me, when you read the old law, there's restrictions for the Sabbath. You couldn't do certain things, travel certain distance. Where is it that it says you can't speak?
Well, the thing of it is, they had constructed these rules. They had their own system of rules that were not based in the law of Moses. That's the problem. And they always coming back to Jesus because, they said, you can't heal on the Sabbath day. Where does the Old Testament say you can't heal on the Sabbath day? That it's a Sabbath violation to do a miraculous healing on the Sabbath. They're just grasping at straws, right? They're just grasping at straws. Wayne?
You can pull an ox out of the ditch on the Sabbath, but you couldn't heal him in.
Yeah, exactly. Crazy. But of course, so they made a complaint, a grievance, because this had happened on the Sabbath. Jesus had gotten away from that spot. Verse 13 says, and 14 later he finds the man. I got a question for you. In verse 14, behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. Oh boy. Does this mean that the guy was having this physical trouble because he had sinned? That the sin was a result of the infirmity was a result of his sinning? Because, there has always been that view. If things are going bad for you, and especially if you're sick, that's proof God's mad at you and you've been sinning, and that's why this is happening to you. I'm going to tell you, if you wanted to teach that view, and you were willing to pluck verse 14 out of the context, that'd be a pretty good verse, I think, to try and teach that. And it's not true. We know it's not true because, righteous and unrighteous alike get sick and die. So what would it be? You're made whole. Don't sin anymore, lest a worse thing. What would be the worst thing? He'd been sick for 38 years. What's the worst thing? Eternal punishment, right? Something way worse than what you've been dealing with will come your way if you live a sinful life. You'll go to hell. I think that's the answer, don't you? Verse 14. But the Jews hated him. Verse 16, they persecuted Jesus, sought to slay him. So this is one of the earliest references to where, okay, now we're going to kill him. One way that we're going to get around to killing him, and sort of the rest of the story is how they go about ultimately to do that. Right? All right, interesting stories. Thanks for your input tonight.